is great to have you all here. Thank you for coming to this session, this breakout session on trauma-informed care in a COVID world. Just to let you know that there is a copy of my PowerPoint presentation that is attached in the breakout session descriptor. So you're welcome to take notes, but if you'd prefer, there is already the PowerPoint slides available for you. By way of introduction, before we start, my name is Sarah Scott Webb. I'm based in New Zealand, where it is currently evening time, hence why the dark and the lights. And I'm based here in New Zealand, but I serve and work globally. I co-lead an anti-trafficking ministry called For Freedom, which is part of SIM International, a large global faith-based organisation, a mission organisation that has more than 4,000 workers in 70 plus countries. Our role at For Freedom is to coordinate SIM's global response to trafficking and provide strategic guidance and support to workers with vulnerable and at-risk populations. This year as well, I have been involved with the European Freedom Network and their response to the Ukraine war. I've been part of a team and coordinating EFN's trauma team, helping to find and provide support and trauma resources for churches and refugees both within Europe and the Ukraine. I've been involved with anti-trafficking for most of the past 16 years. I initially started volunteering as a music therapist for Hagar, Cambodia, and I have continued a long history with Hagar, and this has been really quite key for me because Hagar as an organisation was a very early adopter of a trauma-informed approach, both to working with trafficking survivors and caring for their staff. And this is an approach that today is even more necessary and important. So today we're going to, I'm just going to share my screen first, that might help. Today we're going to be having a look at 3 questions. Why is trauma-informed care important? What is trauma-informed care? And how do we implement a trauma-informed approach? So as we start, I have a question for you, and you're welcome to put this in the chat. Why is trauma-informed care so important? If you'd like to put your answers there in the chat, that would be great. If you're watching this online or after the event, have a think as well. Why is trauma-informed care important? That's great. For me, as I have reflected on this question, there are 2 key areas. The first is because of the very high links between human trafficking and trauma. We know that those who have been trafficked often experience very high rates of trauma and PTSD. Women in commercial sex trafficking have been found to experience post-traumatic stress equivalent to the rates, or at rates equivalent to veterans of combat war. We also know that anti-trafficking workers are exposed to really high rates of secondary trauma. We know that one of the most at-risk groups for trafficking are those who have experienced significant trauma. And because of this, trauma-informed care is in itself a powerful trafficking prevention tool. But there's also another reason why I think trauma-informed care has become vitally important, and that is because of the increased trauma being caused by COVID. Globally, around the world, baseline levels of trauma are much, much higher than pre-pandemic. Everywhere has been impacted. We are seeing in our communities much higher rates of debt, homelessness, hunger, family violence, abuse, mental health, suicide, job losses, sexual violence, forced labor, forced marriage, online exploitation. And we look at the news to see violence erupting in countries around the world, not to mention the families of the 15 million people who have died due to COVID. And all these things create trauma. We are now living and serving and working in communities that have experienced significant trauma and with people who are traumatized. This is creating much higher levels of stress for all of us, and it is increasing rates of burnout. And in anti-trafficking, this was already of significant concern. We need to be equipped to cope with this change, and being trauma-informed is a really key way of doing so. So what do we mean by trauma-informed care? Well, in essence, it's being able to work effectively with traumatized people. Trauma-informed care is about treating the whole person, taking into account past trauma and their resulting coping mechanisms. Trauma-informed care understands that victims of trauma do not always react or behave how we might expect. It understands that many of the people we work with and alongside will have experienced trauma, and that trauma has a neurological, biological, physiological, and social effect on each individual person. Being trauma-informed means that those we serve and work with feel safe and respected and empowered. And this creates a safe space that will bring healing and enable them to recover. It also means that we feel safe and empowered and supported to provide the support they need. And this is one of the things that I find really exciting about trauma-informed care, is that when we do it, when we implement this, it actually enables a space where people can heal and recover. A key part of trauma-informed care is a paradigm shift in our thinking. When we're trauma-informed, our question changes from looking at someone who is frustrating us, stressing us, who is overreacting or reacting inappropriately. And instead of looking at this person and going, oh, what's wrong with you? Our question becomes, what's happened to you to cause you to act in this way? An example might be someone that we work with who is always forgetting everything. We feel like we're having to tell them the same information over and over again. We think, oh, things go in one ear and out the other. She doesn't remember anything I tell her. But when we're trauma-informed, we think, what might be happening? It could be that trauma actually results in extreme attention to threat. Our body is in survival mode and our focus is only on things we perceive as danger. Everything else, including unnecessary information, is shut down and forgotten. Another example, we may have someone we work with who we just think is lying, who's making things up. She constantly makes things up. She's such a liar. What she's saying doesn't make any sense. I can't understand anything. She's saying something completely different to what she said yesterday. But when we're trauma-informed, we think what might be happening. And we remember trauma causes gaps in our memory that is known as disassociation. Because to survive, we need things to make sense. And when we are missing pieces, when we have gaps in our thinking, it's an automatic response to try and fill them in. Another example, we may have somebody in our workplace who is always getting angry, exploding, overreacting, yelling at others, emotional outbursts. We think, oh, he just overreacts about everything. But when we're trauma informed, we might remember that our brain is wired to respond to danger and trauma in these ways. It prepares us to fight, for flight, and to freeze. Our most basic survival response is to fight, to be aggressive. And when we're trauma informed, we can ask the question underneath that behavior we're seeing and think, maybe we need to help that person feel safe. When we're trauma informed, we are able to look beneath the behavior and calm someone down. Yesterday, there was a great session, a breakout session that Ruth did on understanding the brain. And there were some really great things in there that it touches on and really complements a lot of this trauma-informed training. I really recommend, if you didn't see it yesterday, it's worth having a look at as well. Being trauma-informed helps us work effectively with traumatized people. And it's built upon 5 principles. Safety is the first one. Ensuring the physical and emotional safety of an individual is the first important step that we can take towards providing trauma-informed care. And this is one of the first things that we can do if we get presented with behaviors like we have just looked at. We can think, how can we help that person feel safe? Because when people feel safe, they stop operating from their survival brain and begin to feel calm and better able to cope and respond. We can create safety through basic changes in our behavior. For example, not standing tall over somebody or getting too close to them. We can think about the physical environment that we have. Is it quiet? Is it calm? Is it undisturbed? And we can start to create emotional safety for people by reassuring them, by validating their feelings. What you are feeling is a really normal response to what you have gone through. These things help somebody to feel safer. Next, an individual needs to know that we are trustworthy, that they can trust us, that we are safe. Being transparent about what we are doing or what we are hoping a course of action will achieve. Being confidential. Making sure the person knows and understands why we are doing something. This all helps to create trustworthiness and enables a person to feel safe and for healing to happen. The third principle is choice. And those who have experienced trauma should feel empowered to take charge of their lives and to make their own decisions. If there is a simple choice, give it. It could be as simple as, would you like a cup of tea or a cup of coffee? Would you like to have your counselling session before lunch or after lunch? And being empowered to make small choices like this are actually a really key step in the healing process. Collaboration is another principle that's really important. And this is the idea of working together, of working alongside, involving the client in their own care, rather than a power dynamic or telling them what they need to do. We explain why. We invite questions and feedback and suggestions from them. It's a mindset of, let's work together on your healing and journey at your pace. And the last principle of trauma-informed care is empowerment, helping somebody to regain control back of their life. Don't take over. Encourage people to take positive action themselves. Validate, reassure their feelings, listen to what they need, help them regain control of their lives again. These 5 principles are what trauma-informed care is all about. Being intentional about providing safety and choice, being trustworthy and transparent, working collaboratively, and to empower those in our care. And as we'll see shortly, when we work in this way, it actually enables healing to happen. As well as 5 core principles, trauma-informed care is guided by 4 assumptions, known as the 4 R's. We realize the widespread impact of trauma. We recognize the signs and the symptoms of trauma in our clients and their families and our staff that we work with. We respond by integrating our knowledge of trauma into our policies and our organizational practice. And the last one is we resist re-traumatizing those in our care. A key to being trauma-informed is understanding trauma and the impact that it has on people. We've got to be familiar with the signs of trauma and know what to look for. And we're going to have a very brief look at this now. One definition of trauma is that it is the result of an event outside the range of usual human experience, which causes great distress. It involves intense fear, horror, helplessness, and it overwhelms the person's capacity to cope. What are some examples of the types of trauma the people you work with have experienced? If you would like to unmute yourself and just, share some examples, you're very welcome to. On the side, we have examples here of maybe trauma from a disaster, from abuse. We have here down the bottom, a little box that's some of the types of trauma. We may be working with people who have physical abuse. They may have experienced physical neglect, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. They may have been involved in a war. They may have experienced trauma associated with grief. The types of trauma are many. They can roughly be grouped into 4 categories. Sorry, my screen seems to have just frozen here. I'll just have to come out. I'll try this again, sorry. The 4 categories of trauma. Acute trauma is an isolated incident. It is the result of a single incident. We have chronic trauma, which is chronic, that is ongoing. It's repeated and prolonged. An example of chronic trauma might be domestic violence. It might be abuse. Complex trauma is when multiple types of trauma are occurring at the same time. And this is what we have been seeing with the Ukraine. Many different types of trauma being experienced by people. And generational trauma also occurs. This is often seen as a result of war and conflict. When large numbers of people have experienced a significant trauma that is not healed, this then is passed on, this sort of trauma behavior, this trauma coping mechanism is then passed on to following generations. We saw this in Cambodia in the generation after the genocide of Pol Pot. And then complicating this response to these types of traumas is the fact that two people may experience the same traumatic event, but then have very different responses. We need to be aware not only of the type of trauma that a person has experienced, but we need to consider some factors that influence the differences in how someone experiences that. Things like their personal and family history of trauma. Have they experienced trauma before? Has their family experienced traumatic events before? What about the nature of the traumatic event? The trauma from a sexual attack versus a job loss versus a car accident may all be slightly different. Another factor to consider is culture. How does a person's culture treat trauma or people who have experienced trauma? Is there a lot of shame associated with that? What about their age or their stage of development? A child versus a developing teenager versus an adult. The number of supportive relationships or social supports a person has can also help somebody navigate through trauma. And the response of others after the trauma. Are they believed and listened to? And this factor on its own plays a huge part in determining how well a person recovers from a traumatic event. You can read this slide in a lot more detail if you have the PDF afterwards, but the impacts of trauma are huge. We lose our sense of self-worth, our sense of self, our physical connection to our body. We lose trust. We lose our feeling of safety. We may feel overwhelming shame. And we can see this manifested in responses like this. We may experience chronic pain in our body or headaches, eating disorders, insomnia, not being able to concentrate, a loss of interest in things, depression, hypervigilance, not being able to remember things, always being easily startled, many impacts. And the physical impact alone of trauma is huge. Trauma impacts our brain, the structure in our brain. It impacts our neural pathways. It impacts the hormones that are released in our body and flood through. It impacts our body's ability and our kidneys and liver to eliminate toxins. It affects our nervous system. It affects our immune system. There is no doubt that trauma has a deep neurological and physical impact on our bodies and our behavior. And here's why. For me, when I was volunteering as a music therapist many years ago, this whole thing with trauma and how it actually impacted somebody made sense to me when I understood that when someone experiences trauma, the brain shuts down and disconnects. We disconnect from others, we disconnect from ourselves. In times of trauma, our body is wired to shut down everything that is not essential for survival. We have at the back of our head, at the top of our brain stem here, and it's on this illustration, the area in black, a part of our brain called the amygdala, and it is like an overriding master power switch. When we experience trauma, this switch goes straight on and everything else shuts down. In this picture of the brain here, we see an area highlighted in yellow, and this is our prefrontal cortex part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that has our ability to remember. It has our memory. It's our impulse control. It's the part of our brain where we plan, where we make decisions. It's the part of our brain that helps us have attention. It's the part of our brain that moderates our behavior, helps us to think about consequences. But when we experience trauma, that gets shut off, turned off. The blue area on this map is the limbic system. This is the part of our brain that controls our emotions and our behavior. When we experience trauma, it gets turned off. And instead, this amygdala at the primal base gets turned on, and it completely overrides our system. It floods our bodies with adrenaline and cortisol, and we get in the state of fight and flight and freeze. This is our automatic trauma response. Our brain shuts down and our focus is on survival. And this is why people react and behave in ways we don't expect them to. It's why they don't respond when we try and reason with them. They can't, because their brain is shut down. It's why our body, when we experience trauma, can feel sick or cold or unusual pain, because everything that is not needed for survival is shut down. And this is not just an emotional response to trauma, it's actually a very physical, biological response. Our brain shuts down to enable us to cope. Now, I'm a bit of a neuroscience-y geek. I love looking at these kind of things, and I wanted to show you a couple of examples of what I mean, because trauma is a very real thing, the impacts of it. Now, this scan here on the left is a scan of a healthy brain of a healthy child who hasn't experienced trauma. And we can see in this picture on the left a high amount of red and yellow areas in the brain, which indicate high function and high activity, especially this area at the front that we talked about, the prefrontal cortex, with all our attention and memory and planning and moderating behavior. Our thinking part of the brain is fully engaged. We can see on that it's well balanced. We can see the brain is well connected. But on the right-hand side is a scan of a child who was abused and suffered neglect, ongoing chronic trauma. And you can see the difference, the physical difference in brain function because of trauma. Straight away, we can see the prefrontal cortex isn't working anywhere near at capacity. We can see as well there are much higher levels or colours of black and blue in this brain, which indicate low or no activity. The brain has shut down. We can see down the bottom at the back, the amygdala is much more dominant. That's the strongest area here. This child is definitely still in this trauma crisis state. And the other part to notice are where the circles are. These are the temporal lobes in our brain. This is the part of our brain that processes emotions, that helps us with language and memory and perception. We can see in the healthy brain, that's fully functional and alive, but we can see in the traumatized brain, shut down. The brain has disconnected and the amygdala switch turns on. Another scan here of an adult brain. On the left, this is a healthy brain, no in trauma. We can see here on this brain, down the back, there's not one center amygdala that's red and healthy. There are these two back parts. And these bits here are actually called the occipital lobe. And their job is to help us interpret the world. It's kind of like our processing center. All the information we see and we take in through our senses gets processed here, and we make sense of it, and on we go. In a healthy brain, that is how that looks and responds. On the right, we have a scan of a person with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress disorder. Like many trauma and many trafficking survivor brains can look. And we can see on this brain quite a different looking brain. The occipital lobe, the bit down the back that's helping us process everything, turned off. And in its place, we can see the center amygdala firing into gear. We can see throughout this brain all these areas of white, and that is actually inflammation in the brain because of the cortisol hormone that is being flooded through. It's inflaming the brain, keeping the person in the state of high alert and vigilance. This person on the right is in fight or flight mode with no ability to be able to regulate their behavior. And I think when we start to understand that this is what is actually happening in the brain when we experience trauma, it becomes much easier for us to adjust our expectations and change our question to what's happened to you. What's happening in your brain that's making you act like this? And when we apply the 5 core principles, when people feel safe and listened to and empowered, our body stops being in the state of fight and flight and freeze and begins to relax. Adrenaline and cortisol stop pumping through our body. The amygdala turns off, and the other parts of our brain, our memory, our behavior and thinking, begin to reconnect and turn on. Because this is the exciting thing for me anyway about trauma-informed care, is that it's not just a nice way of doing our work. It's actually key to the healing process. Because yes, trauma causes damage. We've just seen that. But this damage can be healed through a trauma-informed approach to others. Brian Perry is a psychologist who's done a lot of work around this area, and he says this: it is important to remember that a brain altered in destructive ways through trauma and neglect can be healed through a predictable, nurturing relationships with a supportive care team. I find that so encouraging, that being trauma-informed, we may not feel that we have all the answers to be able to provide in-depth counselling that somebody may need, but just being able to provide a trauma-informed approach can actually lay a solid foundation where that person can begin to get in that space where they can heal and recover. By applying the 4 R's and our 5 core principles, you know, that is, people heal and people begin to recover. I just want to pause for a moment here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just ask if anyone's got any questions at this stage. I'll have a look in the chat as well, but we'll just take a bit of a pause in a few moments. If you would like to ask a question, please just unmute yourself and feel free to ask, or pop it in the chat. Yeah, some great comments in here. I like this comment, Winda. Changing paradigm, calling what you call it yoke feelings, or in Indonesian, durian feelings. Instead of focusing on behaviours that are challenging, we ask the deep questions. What are the yoke feelings the survivors experience? Is it sad, fear, or guilt? That's fantastic. If there's no questions, we will keep going. I've just got another little area that I want to cover with trauma-informed care. One of the great things with trauma-informed care is the fact that it kind of is a two-edged sword. It not only is an incredibly powerful way of working with our clients and providing them with tools and a space to be able to heal, but it also applies to us as the support workers, as the caregivers, as the worker. Because when we are trauma-informed, we understand secondary trauma and we prioritise healthy self-awareness and self-care. Because working with traumatised people is challenging. It's stressful. And with more and more trauma occurring in our world, we are being exposed to more and more trauma around us, more and more stress. So it's becoming even more important that we are super intentional about prioritising our own care. We can't pour from an empty cup. We have to make sure our own tanks are full enough to be able to give to others. Otherwise, we will crash and burn. And there are two key parts to this that I want to just briefly cover. And the first is we need to prioritise healthy self-awareness. We need to understand our own personality, our own strengths. Are you more introverted or are you more extroverted? If you are somebody who is more introverted and needs more space and downtime and alone time to get your energy back up, you're going to have to be very intentional about making sure that time is prioritized. If you are extroverted, while it may be easier to keep going and going and going and talking and sharing with others, you need to make sure that there is still that time that your tanks are filled up. Are you someone who operates more from your head or more from your heart? If you are a heart person, you might have to put some extra things in place just to really make sure that you are not being too impacted with secondary trauma. If you are somebody who has a high level of empathy, we need to be particularly careful. And I know a lot of people involved in the work that we do are deeply empathetic. We really want to help. We want to get alongside others. But people with that degree of empathy, it's very easy for us to take on the trauma of others, where we can start to experience secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. So if you know that you are an empathetic person, you need to be very intentional about boundaries and about making sure that you have protective measures to safeguard yourself. We need to be aware of our own past trauma. What things trigger memories of our own trauma? What are some of the things that stress us? And I encourage you to spend a little bit of time just thinking through these. What things stress you and what things calm you down? When you feel yourself getting frustrated or stressed, what are some things that you can do to help regulate your own self, to help calm yourself down? Spending some time thinking about these self-aware tools is very, very valuable. The other part of self-care, of this with trauma-informed care, is self-care. It's all very well to be aware of what we're like, what we are like, but we have to also take care of ourselves, because if we don't, we are not going to be able to do the work that we have to do. We need to get good with boundaries. You know, it is okay to say no. We need to know our limits and our capacity, and be okay with the fact that we can't save everyone. We can't do everything. We usually are working as part of a team as well. You know, we can share the load, but we need to know our limits. What are you capable of doing? What is your capacity? And capacity may fluctuate depending on what else you have going on in your life, and that's okay as well. Self-care has a nice little acronym, the ABCs of self-care. The A is awareness, some of the things we just talked about. B stands for balance. Are you maintaining a balance in your life? Have you got a balance between work and home? Have you got a balance between time with friends and family and your work? Have you got a balance in your life in terms of a rhythm of good sleep, exercise, nutritious food? All of these things are taking care of your body. And the C is for connection. We are not made to do life on our own. For us to be strong, for us to take care of ourselves, we have to stay connected to others. And whether that is connected to your family, connections with your friends, if you're a person of faith, strong connections with your community of faith. These things have to be considered, and they are important. And the last one here I have down is supervision. And I don't know how many of you have a professional supervisor, but this is something that I have found is so beneficial in terms of my capacity to be able to keep going in anti-trafficking ministry. A professional supervisor is different from a pastor. It's different from a counsellor. It's different from a friend. A professional supervisor is somebody that you can have a regular appointment with, who can hold you accountable, who can ask some of the difficult questions, who can help you work through difficult situations or challenging scenarios you may be facing. If this is not something that you currently have, I would really encourage you to explore this. It is a hugely valuable tool in helping us be able to sustain our ministry and our work. So just to finish off, how do we implement a trauma-informed approach? First of all, we've got to learn about trauma and its impacts. Secondly, we change our thinking from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. We adopt the 5 core principles of safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And we practice deep self-awareness and deep self-care. We'll open up for questions in a moment, but my email is there on the last slide of the PDF version as well. You're very welcome to get in touch with me if you have any questions. If you would like a copy of the PowerPoint to share with any of your teams, you're very welcome. I'm more than happy to pass that on to you as well. But I'll stop sharing my screen now, and you're welcome to put your cameras on, put your microphones on, and we'll have a look at some of these questions. I'm just going to read out a couple of these for those who may be watching this online later and may not get these chat comments. One person has commented here, in my organisation, we do a lot of disaster work. For many years, we just address the physical needs, meals, cold water, refreshment. 10 years ago, we began training people as emotional and spiritual care providers. We recognised that people needed immediate care. I think that is really, really crucial as well. That's something I know our colleagues in Europe have been noticing as well. It's not just the physical needs that are needing to be met, it's that need for care and reassurance and safety. Great comment. Another comment, our organisation, UMN, conducted psychosocial counselling session to migrant returnees after they lost their jobs and returned to their hometown due to COVID-19. Now they're doing their daily works and running their livelihoods activities as usual as before the pandemic. It's a very important thing. And a question, have you experienced working with staff that also have trauma that has not been recovered? I have, not personally directly, but colleagues within an organisation that I have worked with were supervising other workers who answered to them, who were social workers and counsellors. And as they started journeying with survivors, it brought up a lot of their own past trauma that hadn't been dealt with. And my colleague actually had to sort of almost stop their direct work with survivors for a little while to get some counselling and support around them, because, you know, I mean, I'm sure any of us here on this call who are working with people who've experienced trauma, if you haven't dealt with your own, it's just continually being triggered. So it's really important. And I did see that in this organisation that I was with my colleague, the amount of work she had to pour into supporting these workers to help them deal with their own trauma. To be honest, not everybody did that well, but I do know there were a couple who got through that and have now risen on, you know, still with the organisation in positions of management. Another awesome comment I will just read out. I have trafficking survivor clients that are also IPV, intimate partner violence victims. I find dealing with IPV situations are more traumatic for me because most of the victims stay with their abusive partners because of a lot of factors. I can say having organisational debriefing sessions help a lot. And of course, just make sure we don't judge our clients and ourselves as well. Thank you. Thank you for that great comment. Well, if there's any other comments or questions, do feel free to pop them in the chat. I will just put in here as well my email again. If anyone would like that, you'll be very welcome to get in touch with me. There's my email there. Well, thank you everyone for coming this evening, this afternoon, wherever it is for you in your time zone. It has been great having you here and being able to talk together about this topic of trauma-informed care. It is something that I am becoming increasingly passionate about. I think as COVID is starting to really, it's the impacts from COVID are starting to really be felt. And I think there is a much broader application of our trauma-informed approach, not just with anti-trafficking organisations. So thank you, everyone. You're welcome to head off to the next session. Look forward to hearing from you or seeing you at another session.